Wow, wow, wow. Would you believe we're on the last section of Unit 2? So, we are finishing up photosynthesis, and as you can see on the screen, we are discussing cellular respiration here. Woohoo! Okay, so little disclaimer here. If you guys have read through your Section 3 of photosynthesis unit, you probably are like pulling your hair out, going, what on earth did I just read? So I hope that, hope, you're watching this in conjunction with reading this, with reading that unit, because I'm hoping that I can kind of bring some sense to it. Section 3 is one of the hardest things that you probably will ever learn in biology. I specifically remember this actually in college biology. So your Section 3 gives you a little bit too much detail for high school biology. What I'm going to go over tonight, well, it's night for me, who knows when you guys are watching it. What I'm going to go over in this lesson is basically what I want you to know, the big picture things, okay? I'm not going to test you on the specific little things that happen within cellular respiration. Okay, so let's get going. I'm going to try and make this a little short and sweet, but nonetheless, we are dealing with cellular respiration, so not necessarily short and sweet. Okay, so first of all, here's a lovely picture here. Chemical energy. Well, let me kind of go over this a little bit. Let me bring this closer to the middle of the screen here. We've got three things that we're going to talk about. Okay, we're going to talk about step one, glycolysis. We'll see what goes through there. And if you notice this lovely kidney bean shape, hopefully you guys recognize that as maybe the mitochondrion. We're going to talk about it extensively in Unit 3 when we talk about cell structures. But you're going to get to know the mitochondria a little bit because that's where a lot of these things take place. One in particular, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Okay? So, kind of big picture here. What is in yellow? What do you see that's in yellow? I'm hoping you're noticing the ATPs. Hopefully you remember what ATP is. So important, okay? It is the energy that our body uses to basically sustain every type of activity that's going on cellular level, okay? Not just like, oh, I want to go for a walk down the street. We're talking on a cellular level that allows your body to do each and every little thing when it comes to that walk, okay? So very important, but let's get, we'll come back to that. So I know on to some more confusing stuff. I'm hoping that biology is going to be a little liberating for some of you guys and not so like, oh my gosh, I don't get anything. So, okay, one more picture. Same picture, but kind of cute because it's with a crayon. Crayons make everything so happy. So, cellular respiration can be a happy thing if you just color it, right? No, actually, we're just looking at pretty much the same thing here. Just another view. Hopefully it gets it in your head of yours. That pretty little head. Okay, but why cellular respiration? Why is that so important? Well, most importantly is you've got to have energy to survive, right? Okay, we think about, oh, well, I could deal without energy, right? I could just sit on the couch, watch TV all day. I don't really need energy. But I'm talking energy again on a cellular level. Every cell in your body, which you have trillions of cells, depends on energy in order to do its function, and each cell in our body has a different function. So obviously we get that energy from food. Hopefully you're not eating this, gross, but nonetheless we do need our energy to survive, and we ultimately get that from eating. So alright, how about some visuals? I've got a couple videos, not very many, because when I go to look for videos on cellular respiration and the components, there's not very many to choose from, so be patient with me. But here's some visuals. Not the best, but it'll have to do.
I'm learning about cellular respiration.
What is cellular respiration?
It's how cells make ATP out of food.
What's ATP?
ATP is what cells use for energy. Like we use money. Cells use ATP to do all the stuff cells do. It starts with glycolysis. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. It begins with 1 glucose. 2 ATP are added to the glucose.
But wait, you add ATP? I thought you were making ATP. This sounds like government accounting.
No. cells only invest 2 ATP because they will make a total of 4 ATP. The glucose is split into 2 pyruvates. While that happens, a total of 4 ATP are made. In the end, you have 2 net ATP, 1 NADH, and 2 pyruvates.
2 ATP. Is that like making $2 a day? That doesn't sound like much to live on.
Glycolysis is not the only thing. Aerobic cells have mitochondria.
Aerobic cells? What are they?
Aerobic means to use oxygen.
Oh, like us.
Yes, most creatures we know are aerobic. Eukaryotic cells have mitochondria. The aerobic part of cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. First, there is the Krebs cycle. The 2 pyruvates enter the matrix of the mitochondria. Here they enter the cycle where electrons and hydrogens are stripped away. They are given to the electron carriers FAD and NAD. For each turn of the cycle, carbon dioxide is produced along with 1 ATP in addition to the NADH and the FADH2.
Is that it? What happens with all those electrons and hydrogens that were given to the NAD and FAD?
All those electrons carried by NADH and FADH2 are brought to the electron transport chain. The chain is on the cristae of the mitochondria. The electrons and hydrogens are used to make ATP. Once the electrons and hydrogens complete their journey down the chain, they are picked up by oxygen, resulting in water as a byproduct. In the end, 38 ATP are made from 1 glucose.
Who knew cells worked so hard to make money? I'm glad I'm not a cell.
Okay, so even though those characters are a little dry, it's basically what we're going to talk about tonight. Hopefully you guys can, as you see some of the videos, they're going to be kind of the same thing, but repetition helps you to learn this stuff. So you heard a little bit about the process, and they were pretty much, right on, and it was fairly basic, so hopefully you could follow along. Well, let's talk about some of those a little bit more in depth, okay? Before we get into that, though, I do want to mention aerobic versus anaerobic. Those lovely, crazy, whatever they are, I don't know if they're bears or whatever, they were talking about aerobic. They didn't really talk a whole lot about anaerobic. But aerobic, anytime you hear that, basically this is and let me kind of zoom in here. Aerobic processes take place in the presence of oxygen, while anaerobic, and anytime you see an or a, that usually means no or not. So basically we're talking about no oxygen. So anaerobic processes take place without oxygen. So let me give you guys some examples, because you're going to see where this fits in just a little bit. So aerobic, and I picked this picture because don't we all wish we were just running along a beach right now? But anytime you're doing any kind of sustained activity, maybe you go on a long walk, maybe you go on a hike, maybe you go on a mountain bike ride, maybe you go on a run. It's endless. But anytime you're doing something like this, typically endurance activities, we call those aerobic exercises because you're constantly using oxygen, okay? You have time to breathe in oxygen, even though you might be out of breath, you're still breathing in oxygen, and your body can continue to generate ATP because you have oxygen, okay? On the other hand, if you're doing an anaerobic activity, which typically is something that is very fast-paced and doesn't last for very long. So I usually relate that to sprinting, lifting weights, okay? Because again, you're not really spending a bunch of time doing it. You might do a rep or two, hopefully more than that, maybe 10 reps of something, and then you take a rest, okay? You're not really out of breath, but you may expend a lot of energy, especially like in a sprint that may only last 10 seconds long. You're expending a lot of energy, but you're not bringing in a lot of oxygen. So we call that an anaerobic activity. And I'm going to show you what happens in cellular respiration when we have no oxygen present, okay? But we'll come back to that. So remember those terms. Let's talk about the first step, glycolysis, okay? The first step in breaking down food to produce energy. Remember, you eat a big hamburger, and I use hamburger, even though, please, try to cut back on the hamburgers, for goodness sakes. Eat healthy, but okay, that's another topic. So you eat some food, and you need to break that food down into energy that your cells can actually use, okay? So the first thing is, obviously, food begins in the form of simple sugars. When your body breaks it down, which we'll talk about this next semester when we go over the digestive system, But how your body breaks it down is you eat these foods, and ultimately most of your foods turn into simple sugars, glucose, okay? Really carbohydrates are broken down into that. You still have proteins and fats, but ultimately carbohydrates, which is typically a huge portion of your diet, are broken down into simple sugars. Glucose is like table sugar, okay? Easy, right? So think about that. We're taking glucose, a molecule of glucose, and this is happening within the cell, and let's see what happens with that molecule of glucose, okay? Let me make this a little bit smaller so you guys can see everything. So this is, again, stage 1, glycolysis. You take a glucose molecule. Remember, ATP is this high energy molecule, okay? This is what our cells need. It's kind of what they said, that's that currency that the cells use for energy. But actually, in the first part of glycolysis, you actually have to use 2 ATPs, okay? So basically, you are giving off one of these high energy phosphates to this glucose, okay? And I'm not going to go into these specific names because I'm not going to test you on those, but I want you to know the overall what's happening in glycolysis, and what is produced is one of the big things. So you're using 2 ATPs, giving off those phosphates, and you're forming ADP, which is a lower energy molecule. Okay, all of a sudden you have fructose diphosphate, splits off into these 3 phosphate glucose molecules, okay? And basically through here, remember NADH is also a high energy molecule, but only when you add that hydrogen to it. So NAD plus gains a hydrogen, okay, on both of these, because there's 2 molecules here, okay? So you have 1 molecule here, 1 molecule here. These are happening simultaneously. So you get 2 NADH, and then you also, now you're producing ATP here. So you're gaining phosphates, and you're creating this ATP from ADP, and then you have 2 pyruvate acids. These are the molecules that you need to remember, that in glycolysis, you're going from a glucose molecule, and then you are creating, not creating, because we don't really create, but you are forming throughout these chemical reactions, you're forming 2 NADH molecules, and you're forming 2 ATPs. Now it shows you 4, but remember, you had to use 2. So ultimately the net gain is 2 ATPs, and you're gaining 2 pyruvate acid molecules, okay? All right, so here you go. You see that again. The production of 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules, which comes into play when we talk about the Krebs cycle, and a net gain of 2 ATP come from glycolysis, along with NADH, okay? So that's very important. I want you guys to know that for your test. Hint, hint, hint. Know what the production of glycolysis produces, okay? All right, now, one last thing I want you to know. Anytime you are giving a phosphate, so basically a transfer of a phosphate group, we call that substrate level phosphorylation. And that's a big term, but you need to know that that's how the ATP is produced. You basically are transferring that phosphate group from the ADP to ATP to create that high energy phosphate molecule, okay? But that term substrate level phosphorylation is something that we use in glycolysis because that's how those ATP are formed. All right, now moving on, let's go to the Krebs cycle. Very complicated cycle. Again, when you get to college, you're going to know every single detail of this, but let's get the big picture of it. This is what happens when oxygen is present, okay? So say just everyday life. Right now I'm sitting here teaching you guys. I've got plenty of oxygen coming on. The Krebs cycle is happening as we speak. Now I go out for a sprint, things change. We'll talk about that in a second. So the Krebs cycle, by the way, let's move back. 2 things about glycolysis. Oh boy, I need to scroll back here a second. Okay, 2 big things about glycolysis. Let me kind of go back. Glycolysis, first of all, takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. That's something very important because you have to know where these things take place. So glycolysis is happening no matter what, if there's oxygen or no oxygen. You're always going to have glycolysis take place. So you're always producing a small amount of ATP regardless of the oxygen, being present or not. Okay, so again, takes place in the cytoplasm. Now, the Krebs cycle, though, we're going to talk about where that takes place. So, again, only present when there's oxygen, okay? Now, taking place in the matrix of the mitochondria, okay? So, mitochondria, if you guys have remembered this picture from past, because I know you've seen a picture of it, the mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell because it produces ATP there. So the matrix is actually within, see that purple area? That's the matrix of the mitochondria. This is where the Krebs cycle is taking place, okay? So back to some other stuff. Here is the lovely, huge picture here. The big picture of we also call it the citric acid cycle. So don't get confused. The Krebs cycle and the citric acid cycle are the same thing. Those terms are kind of used interchangeably. And I mean, why those are named that way, there's some background behind that. I'm not going to get into that. But I want you to notice this is a cycle that's continually going, and there's constantly things that are coming off of it, if you notice, and going into it. So you start off with this acetyl-CoA, okay? And you have coenzymes. You have enzymes that are happening constantly. Remember, enzymes speed up reactions, and they're allowing reactions to take place. So within this citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, you have constantly these enzymes that are aiding this cycle and keeping it going, okay? So I'm not going to go through again all of these different things. What I want you guys to notice is that you have certain things going in, but look what's coming out. You're going from NAD plus to NADH, which is a high energy molecule, okay, giving off CO2. So CO2, carbon dioxide, is another product of the Krebs cycle along with NADH, okay? Here's another NADH, and now we've also produced some ATP, okay? More CO2 is coming off. And then FAD, you're going to hear that thrown around, another high energy molecule. So FAD now is turned into FADH2, which is a high energy molecule, more NAD. So if you notice, there's all of these high energy molecules that via the electron transport chain, all of these, which we're going to talk about, the electron transport chain is coming up next. But all of these high energy molecules are going to be transferred basically into ATPs. Okay, so it's very important that through this Krebs cycle, you see that you have NADH produced, CO2 is released, more NADH, more CO2, ATPs, FADH2, which are high energy as well, and some more NADH as well. So lots of high energy molecules produced in the Krebs cycle. All right, so produces a small amount of ATP, NADH, which you guys just saw, and FADH2. These are the high energy molecules that the Krebs cycle gives off, okay, along with CO2. All right, here's some visuals. See if you can follow along. Buffering. Come on, video. Don't fail me now. Man, oh man. If this takes too long, I'm going to include the link under your link to this lesson because I don't like waiting. Waste of time, right? Okay, I'm actually going to continue on. I'm going to show you this. Okay, maybe not. Okay, stopping. So this is actually a really cool video that some high school students put together, and I am going to include the link because I want you guys to watch it and see if you can follow along through, because it takes you through glycolysis, it takes you through the Krebs cycle, and it takes you through the last part that we're going to talk about shortly, the electron transport chain. So please watch that, see if you can follow along, because again, some of you guys are super visual learners, I am, and it's really nice to see it kind of acted out in kind of a creative way. So click on that link. You'll see this below the link for this lesson. Okay, now let's go back to anaerobic versus aerobic. I told you we'd come back. Remember, what happens if you don't have oxygen available and we have to go into the anaerobic phase, okay? The anaerobic, and it's kind of, you know, looks a little crazy here, of course, but we call this lactic acid fermentation. That basically, in the presence of no oxygen, you have those pyruvate molecules that were produced by glycolysis, and if there's no oxygen, they can't continue on into the Krebs cycle, okay, because that requires oxygen. So instead, you have these glucose molecules that still undergo some, well, here's glycolysis. This is what happens normally. Okay, you have the glucose molecule. But then these pyruvic acid molecules don't really have anywhere to go except for fermentation. Okay, and in fermentation, basically you're taking these NADH molecules, the high energy, you're breaking off those hydrogen, and you have a lower energy, but now you're ending up with something called lactic acid. So a lot of you guys have experienced this if you've gone out on a hard run or you exercise and you haven't done something in a while, and the next day you're doing fine, but then the following day you're like, gosh, I feel every muscle in my body. Well, it's because lactic acid has built up, okay? And basically your body has to work for a couple of days to break that lactic acid up and start back into the Krebs cycle, okay? So lactic acid is something that is a normal thing. So if you're sore, that's not a bad thing. That's just saying that basically you were doing exercise in the presence of no oxygen. Now, as you get in better shape, your body learns to kind of carry on the Krebs cycle longer until you have to go into this anaerobic phase, okay? Here's another picture of it. Again, the anaerobic phase right here. This is showing glucose in the glycolysis part, where you create 2 pyruvic acids, but then with the help of 2 ATP, you are creating lactic acid or alcohol. But really, we're only focusing on this part because we don't ferment alcohol. We ferment lactic acid, okay? But if you have oxygen, you go into the aerobic respiration, which is cellular respiration that we've been talking about. Okay, on to the last part, electron transport system or electron transport chain. This, again, there's some incredible detail in your section. Don't be overwhelmed. I want you to kind of get the main gist. So, the main thing is, this is a series of protons embedded in the inner membranes. We call that the cristae of the mitochondrion. So here's again another picture of the mitochondria, okay? And if you notice, this blue area is the matrix. That's where the Krebs cycle takes place. There's a big spider on my wall. Just caught sight of it. Nice. And the cristae is actually this membrane that surrounds the matrix, okay? Membranes all have similar features, and you guys are going to see that a ton next unit when we talk about membranes of the cell. But this membrane is very similar as well, and this is where the electron transport chain takes place, okay? So moving on, here's what it looks like. Notice this picture of the mitochondria. This little box right here has been blown up right here. So this is actually the membrane of the cristae, so this circular part right here. Membranes look very similar, in which you have this phospholipid bilayer. And within the electron transport chain, you have these proteins that are embedded here. And basically, like the term electron transport chain, you're kind of transporting electrons through this system, okay? And in the process, you're making a lot of ATP out of this, okay? You're also making water. That's another byproduct of the electron transport chain, okay? So again, this is very confusing, and if I were to actually try to explain this to you right now, you'd probably hate me. So what I want you to understand is what the electron transport chain is, okay? It's these proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane of the cristae, okay? So this membrane of the cristae right here. And basically you're transferring these electrons in order to basically create ATP. And we create it by, again, transferring phosphates from ADP to ATP. Now there's a different name for this, okay? We actually call that chemoosmosis. So that's the process within the electron transport chain in which we're forming ATP. So remember in glycolysis, we talked about forming ATP through substrate phosphorylation, substrate level phosphorylation. Well, in the electron transport chain, we call that chemiosmosis. Sorry, I'm not having a very easy time pronouncing anything tonight. But that is, I want you to know that term because you'll see that again, okay? So hopefully you got big pictures of all three of those things. I want you guys to be able to kind of start putting that together. But again, when you go and read through your section, there's a lot of details. So I'm not telling you to skip over it, but maybe try and grab and glean what the big items that you need to know. And especially if you've watched this or you're watching this after, you're going to be like, okay, I get it now. I get it a little bit more. All right, so there's our electron transport system. So look at that stuff. Isn't that beautiful? Photosynthesis, cellular respiration, all in this one little circle. Okay, but one more thing. So what's the point of all this? You know, you guys are like, all right, so great, we made it through Unit 2. Why do we have to go through all this? But the most important thing is, obviously, it's synthesizing ATP. Fool? No, just kidding. But we have to obviously maintain life, and maintaining life requires ATP. So this whole thing, not only just cellular respiration, but photosynthesis is huge, because obviously everything that photosynthesis does and what the plants are become our food. So if we want to be selfish, we can make it all about ourselves, and that we actually have to eat those plants in order to produce ATP. But photosynthesis itself is what keeps the plants going. Ha! Love it, right? Okay, so let's do one more recap. You guys know I love science songs. I love any songs. I love music. But I found this, talk about a really stellar teacher. This is a teacher that put together this next video. And if you can listen closely to her lyrics, I mean, she's pretty catchy too, but she actually talks about in-depth photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So check this out, and then we'll be done.
Wake up in the morning and the plants are so pretty. All the parts in the cells function like a small city. Chlorophyll makes them green. Now that is a fact. When photosynthesis occurs, you better step back. Photosynthesis makes the plants grow. CO2 plus H2O. Chloroplasts are where they go. Now all they need is energy. Sunlight sounds good to me. Split H2O and you get a little ATP. It don't stop, plants are hot, cause they make their own food up. Glucose, yeah that's right. All they need is sunlight. O2 for me and you, but the cycle don't stop, no. It don't stop, plants are hot, cause they make their own food up. Glucose, yeah that's right. All they need is sunlight. O2 for me and you, but the cycle don't stop, no. Stomata are the pores that let the CO2 in. Water's coming from the roots while the sun sinks in. From light to ATP, it makes the reaction go to make C6H12O6 with a side of O. Let reactions in the day, breaking bonds is way okay. Gonna watch the O2 float away. Now the Calvin cycle comes to town. When the sun is going down, don't need no light around for a little fixation. It don't stop, plants are hot, cause they make their own food up. Glucose, yeah that's right. All they need is sunlight. O2 for me and you, but the cycle don't stop, no. It don't stop, plants are hot, cause they make their own food up. Glucose, yeah that's right. All they need is sunlight. O2 for me and you, but the cycle don't stop, no. Glucose buildup, how to break it down. Respiration, it gets it done. Glycolysis, to pyruvate acid, just to ATP, and it's stage 1. The Krebs cycle needs oxygen. Exhale CO2, yeah that's stage 2. The ETC, lots of ATP. H2O must go. This is stage 3. But the cycle don't stop without oxygen. It don't stop when O2 is not able to keep up. Fermentation can still make 2 ATP rays. CO2 regrew, cause the cycle don't stop, no. It don't stop, plants are hot, cause they make their own food up. Respiration, now you see, turns glucose to ATP. Although this song is through, the cycle don't stop now.
Awesome video. I need to get in touch with that chick. She needs to help me with my videos, because you guys know. pretty sad compared to that. She did awesome. If you guys need to listen to that again, I'm going to include that link as well, because what a good recap of the entire unit. Thank you, teacher, whoever you are. But that is it. So I hope you guys have not pulled your hair out by now. I remember doing the same thing, but I promise you're going to see this stuff again. It'll start to make sense. Get the big picture stuff. Okay, that's all. Really all. Have a nice day, evening, night, whatever. Peace out.